Okay, here we are. Hello, everybody. From wherever you are joining, good morning, good afternoon. Today is April 22nd of 2020. This is the SIG API Machinery bi-weekly meeting. We have an agenda with one item, but it's going to be long enough to, entertain us for the meeting. Thank you for coming. And with that, I will give the word to Jordan.
Cool. I actually have a brief demo to start this. If you want to, let me share my screen.
Yes. How do I do that? I will stop sharing. And you should be able to share.
All right. You see my terminal?
Yes.
All right.
Hold on. I don't see your terminal yet.
I see it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I see it. Yeah.
I haven't done anything yet. Anyway, I wanted to talk about something which I realized I had as a work in progress PR for about 1.5 years. So it's time. We announce deprecations of things fairly regularly, a variety of APIs and fields and features and all kinds of things. And we do that in release notes. And those release notes run 30 to 40 pages. And people get bogged down and lose track of what was in them and lose track of when a particular thing got deprecated. And then some number of releases later, it goes away and people are angry. And so this is a proposal for a way to give better visibility to use of deprecated things. And so this is a proof of concept of what it could look like. So I have a file here that has a bunch of beta RBAC objects. These have been deprecated for a couple of releases. You may or may not have known that. I know I love reading 40 pages of release notes, but not everyone does. But what this mechanism would do, if you used kubectl to interact with these objects, it would, the server would spit back warning headers that tell you this type is deprecated, what release it's deprecated in, when it will not be available anymore, if there's a replacement, what you should use instead. And this warning mechanism works at the client level, at the request level. So it works for any type of interaction with the deprecated API. So here I'm getting beta things. It works for any command. So if I annotate those things via the beta APIs, I get warned. kubectl prefers kubectl prefers the GA API. So if I just say get cluster roles, then I'm using the v1 API. But if I explicitly get the beta version, then I get warned. And again, because it works at the client level, this works even for raw requests. If I point kubectl directly at this beta API, I still get the warning headers back, and so I still get the output. So that is a 2-minute vision of what this could let us do. So I linked to the proposal. The key is to set the bar so low for user experience for so many years that when we actually do something that's like, oh, useful information when I need it, it's like, this is amazing. It's kind of the Stockholm syndrome of user experience. But so I linked to the proposal from the agenda, and what this is proposing is actually a general mechanism for communicating warnings from the server to the client, and a pretty unopinionated display of those warnings on the client. The initial use that I am interested in is the one I just showed, where entire versions of APIs are deprecated and have a target removal date or target removal version, and we want to make that much more visible. But there are other uses that we would certainly like to make use of this mechanism for. So the things I wanted to talk about here were the server-side approach that I was considering and the client Go implications. I talked through this some at the SIG CLI meeting for kubectl, and got feedback there. If people have thoughts here, that's fine as well. But as the API machinery folks, the server mechanism and client libraries were what I mostly wanted to talk about. So before I jump in, are there any questions or thoughts that would be helpful for me to keep in mind or kind of try to answer as I'm going along?
My questions in this were not about mechanics. They were about trying to agree on GA criteria for what warnings overall make. Just as you're presenting, cover that at the end.
I have one question about mechanics overall. You've mentioned kubectl will prefer every GA API. There is an exception. Extensions v1 beta 1 has the highest priority for historical reasons.
Mm-hmm.
I think only networking currently is the leftover in that API. I'm not sure if kubectl will be able to keep properly.
Yeah, so ingresses are the sole remaining API in extensions v1 beta 1. That is the only API version where we prefer a deprecated version over a GA version. And like you said, it's for compatibility reasons. This was the first API group that we ever had, and we hadn't yet defined what happens when new stuff comes out.
Do we wanna maybe have a condition for, I don't know. It just seems weird that it will work fine across all of the groups except for ingresses. I'm not sure if there's anything else left in
it's not that it doesn't work for ingresses. I mean, it's kind of accidental that the server prefers the GA versions. That's controlled by setting the precedence, and so like we can continue to set the precedence to, whatever will be best for backwards compatibility. So I don't really see that as being part of this proposal.
I see some intersection when you're considering having a priority use a deprecated API, but I don't think that it blocks this improvement. Just it's worth pointing out, like maybe we shouldn't prefer APIs we know are deprecated. Should there be a way to indicate in discovery that it is deprecated? We have that information now, not related to this feature, but we developed that capability for a different feature.
Yeah, that's related to the question I asked in chat, which is how can I mark a version in a custom resource as being deprecated?
Yeah,
so that it triggers this warning message.
That's currently not possible.
Yeah, I'm taking notes. So for our built-in APIs, ingresses are the lone weird one. I can think about if we would want to try to do anything special there around get specifically. My first inclination would not to be to not special case it. We definitely want to warn if you are writing to the v1 beta 1 API, like that is actually a thing that will stop working in 3 releases or
so we'll read, right? Like, so if you don't know how they invoked it. So if they invoke a read that specifically says it in a script, that script is going to break. And I'm not saying that it blocks this, but I am saying it's weird to not indicate that.
Right. For the question,
in our homegrown discovery instead of the open API discovery, or both places.
Yeah.
Like you wouldn't necessarily, I wouldn't have expected that to go in the schema definition part of the custom resource definition. I would have expected like a tag, like a Boolean field or something.
like at the version level. So
Yeah,
what we're talking about here is version level, but I think eventually field level also makes sense. And so that would be inside the schema. So it's worth considering whether, if we're going to have it in the schema eventually, would a deprecated attribute in the schema at the root level sort of unify the two approaches? I'm not sure, but I'll make a note to kind of add a paragraph as like, here's things to consider after this.
Like, how does that impact it? Do you do that for each request that's sent, or like
Yes.
each add and delete, is it embedded there?
Yep. So if you actually look at what, see if I can do this. What level do I have to do to get headers? There we go. So there's really no magic. Like it just comes back as a HTTP warning header. And so if I do something which involves multiple requests, so like a get with a watch, the list request comes back with a warning. And then when I start the watch, that also comes back with a warning. And the handler that I have wired up in kubectl is deduping identical messages per invocation. So if the list says this API is deprecating going away, and the watch also says this API is deprecating going away, but I do both inside one invocation, kubectl only prints it the first time.
Okay. Thanks.
All right. So what do people want me to walk through the mechanics, or would we like to start with the GA criteria stuff? And I know Daniel got a chance to scan through the mechanics. That might be better to do sort of asynchronously, either by looking at the PR or looking at the design, and maybe talk about what we want to set our criteria to be here.
Is there a PR out? Because I didn't see the PR. The KEP is kind of light on the mechanics, which I think is totally fine. That's the sort of thing that's best to work out in PR anyway.
I thought the mechanics were straightforward, right?
Basically, it uses a similar approach to what we do for audits, where different parts of the handler chain can contribute to an audit event that's associated with the request. This has a warning recorder that's associated with the request, and basically anything anywhere in the stack, all the way from the endpoint handler down through admission, down through strategy validation, that has a handle to that can contribute warnings to the response.
Is it an error to add a warning after the headers have already been written?
It is silently ignored, because what would you do otherwise?
Yeah, I don't know. It would be nice if that caused a bug report, I guess. I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe it's not important. Like, I could see watches screwing it up. I don't know about the rest of our system.
Yeah. I mean, I could change this condition to return something telling you, hey, the warning you wanted, you didn't get it. But practically, I don't know what we would do. Escalating a warning into a fatal error seems not good. I know we could write the warning headers as trailers, because clients have great support for HTTP trailers.
Right, after the watch is finished and shut down cleanly.
So that's the server side. The client side is also relatively straightforward. In the request handler. There's a lot of plumbing to get the handler you want plumbed down, but in the 3 places in client Go where we parse responses from the server, we use a handler that's specific to the client if one was given. Otherwise, we use the default warning handler, and we iterate over them, pass them through the handler, and append them to the result. So programmatic things can get the actual structured data that we parsed out of the headers, or they can just say, for this client, I want to use this handler, and they could do like a no-op, they could do output to standard error, they could output to a log, they could do whatever they want. And that's what I used in kubectl to register the one that deduped and turned it to standard error. So my goal for this was to stand on existing warning header mechanics and not try to overcomplicate the design with like APIs within APIs and lots of coordination between server and client on structure and levels and specific warning codes, like this is a warning about a deprecation, and this is a warning about a field level thing, and this is a warning about this other thing. And I think the RFC about warnings is intentionally leaves clients pretty dumb. It says you can get warnings from servers. If you get them, here are a few different codes, and this is like a general warning, and you should display it to the user if you can. And that's about it. There is another aspect to this, which is registering as a metric when a deprecated API is used. So what I've been talking about up until now is oriented at users. Like I'm a user using kubectl or some client, and I want to be poked when I do something that's problematic. The other side of that is I am a cluster administrator, and I want to know when it's safe to upgrade this cluster to the next version. So I'd like to see if deprecated APIs that are going away in the next version are being actively used right now on those clusters. And so at the same place where we would be adding those warning headers to send back to the client around deprecated API use, we could increment a metric that says this deprecated API targeted for removal at this version just got written to or read from.
Now, you could do that independent of having the warning mechanism.
Yes.
And I'm going to say that compared to many other warnings, that one seems highly structured.
Yes.
Yeah.
That is a metric, so all the metrics are structured.
No, I mean, like I would, when I get to GA criteria, I look and I say, like, for GA, I think we really need to allow warnings to come from, say, our admission webhooks, as a for instance. I don't think I would expect us to track metrics related to warnings from admission webhooks. I mean, maybe, but I would generally leave that up to the server issuing that warning to be able to structure it. And so something that plumbs a metric for warnings doesn't seem immediately valuable, but one that plumbs it for deprecated API usage seems very useful.
Yeah, the metric is not for the warning. The metric is for the deprecated API use.
Yeah. Okay.
So when I started this proposal, I recognized that adding a general warning mechanism is great, and there are, like, I can think of at least 3 or 4 things that I would also want to use it for, but I was trying to avoid gating the design on nailing down all of those things. I think David wants more of those things brought into this proposal as GA criteria. So the specific things are giving admission webhooks a way to contribute warnings to the response. So that would be additional fields in the admission review status. Defining how we would add warnings about field level things, like known bad values or known, basically, if you look at the validation tightening is impossible issue, all the things listed there that we would make fatal errors in validation if we could do it compatibly. But we can't. So for now, we just silently accept data that is almost certainly not what users intend.
Yeah. Or even cases like a CRD update that changes a field from a string to an int. It'd be nice to be able to warn someone that they did it. I wouldn't stop them from doing it, but I think you can be pretty sure that that's going to have consequences they probably want to be told might happen.
Yeah. So just things contributed by admission webhooks, things contributed at the level of like field level validation, and then things contributed inside, I guess, update validation. That would fall under that as well.
Yeah.
So like I said, the mechanism that this adds accommodates that with basically no server-side adjustments. The main questions around that would be the admission review API for webhooks to communicate back warnings. That would be one bit to settle on. And then for things, warnings generated from inside the server, I think the main things we'd want to think about there are like just consistent, like a consistent bar for what is considered worthy of warning. Like I don't want to see this turn into like a, hey, check out this cool new feature style communication to the user. Like I think warnings should be things that are like actually represent problems that we expect users to fix or change or react to.
Yeah.
So I guess my question is, how much specificity do we want around those things at this point in order to proceed with what I see as the first stage of this?
I want to agree that they are GA graduation criteria and they should be listed. Like I would be disappointed to have warnings be considered a GA feature and not be able to have admission webhooks provide them. I don't think that stops anyone from developing warnings and then using it for something like deprecation. That seems like an obvious first step. But before we get to GA and say warnings are a thing, I think we need to have a way for people to use them.
There might be a debate to be had there about how much of the GA signifier is about this is stable and it works, and how much of it is about this is feature complete. I can see both perspectives there.
My instinct is to try, like, given the number of things we have in progress for order of years, my instinct is to try to come up with a discrete chunk of function that solves a specific problem and actually complete it. And then things that are orthogonal get proposed and discussed and done separately. I don't feel that strongly about this, but like I would see working on this deprecation bit as like one person or a group of people are going to go do this, and then if someone is going to tackle the admission bit, like that's a second design. I don't feel that strongly if we want to lump it into one, but.
Yeah, I don't feel that strongly in this case either, which I think is maybe why it's a good time to talk about, a low stakes time to talk about the general principle. I do feel that this concept that David's been pushing on, that like there's a limited time to get something from alpha to beta and then from beta to GA, that is kind of in opposition to requesting that the GA have all the features right from the beginning. So I think I see they're not like 100% opposed to each other, but I see those two thoughts in some conflict.
Is the concern that we would say the deprecation warnings and metrics are GA, and then there would be reluctance to use this mechanism for other things? I guess I'm trying to understand what is
I
the
find
desire?
it hard to say that we build an extensible system and then ask people to contribute to that system and then provide what is a highly valuable feature. In a way, when I read the description, it was built in a way that accommodates something like admission, and actually accommodates admission today for everything built in, but then say we're an extensible system with warnings for everything in tree, but we don't allow those warnings out of tree. I think that's a bad.
So just to put that in different words, it's not so much about being feature complete as it is about we have these users of our system and we don't want to create any like CR. We've worked so hard to get CRs and admission webhooks to not be second-class citizens that it would be a step backwards if we add a feature that actually makes them second-class citizens in some sense.
That's the way I look at that and see it, right? And it looks to me like a situation where everything in tree is special, and well, we're sorry, you can't do that out of tree. I don't want to have to go back to having to answer those questions.
Yeah, I think that is a pretty reasonable general principle. Like I wouldn't want to require all sorts of features in GA, but all of the extensibility features that we've added, we shouldn't add new things that cause us to regress effectively. Does that seem reasonable, Jordan?
Yes. So to tie it to the two extensibility features we have, that means admission webhooks can contribute warnings and CRDs can mark versions as deprecated. Does that mean? And the deprecations trigger the same warnings and metrics that the built-in API versions do, and the admission webhooks contribute warnings the same way anything in process can.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess
maintaining the parity that we already have is a helpful way to think about it.
Yeah, I agree. I wouldn't have gone along with the requirement without this framing, but I think it's pretty compelling.
Okay. 30 mark. And then I think the last comment that was on the CAP currently, so I'll update with that description and that rationale, was around something specific to kubectl actually, which you missed the CLI meeting, David. I'm sorry, you can't bring that up here.
Oh, no, that's dirty. I would like it as a feature, but I do recognize that it is a feature.
So this was an option to basically opt into treating warnings as errors in kubectl. And I guess you wanted it, David, so I'll let you kind of describe it or describe the justification how you would use it.
So being able to see the warnings is great. But I have a lot of automated CI systems and things that we run against our stage environments where, you upgrade a server and you check, does everything still work? and nobody is like sitting there looking at the output. But if I had a way to say, kube control, please fail if you get any warnings back, I would get kicked when I did an upgrade, something was deprecated, and I'm using the deprecated API. And if I had that option on my kube control commands, I would use it for my CI and for my stage systems so that I'd be able to see, oh, well, okay, this needs update. Instead of, great, you gave me a warning, but no one was watching for that warning, and now prod died again.
It'd be a little weird to get a warning and treat it as an error, but then the request actually succeeded. Doesn't that seem a little strange?
Sort of sounds like what make would do though, if you're like trying to compile something and you say treat warnings as errors, that's useful in some cases. So if we had a CLI flag that you can add to say treat warnings as errors, I could see it being useful also.
David, I don't know if you like outlined semantics, but were you thinking a flag, or were you thinking like an environment variable to say like for this script, any errors or any warnings or errors?
For my case, I could do it in either direction, right? I'm like, the difference between mvar and a flag is how many places you have to update, not de-update it. Kube control has avoided mvars. I think that's largely good. So I would probably have done it as a flag. But I'm flexible on that point.
Do you think there is a risk if, so with what I have today, like if you get a warning, it means you're using an API that's going to go away. Like that is a meaningful signal. If warnings get opened up to extension mechanisms, especially, it's hard to predict how much of an error or how much of a potential future error this warning that you got back actually is. Do you think there's a risk of getting back warnings contributed by inconsistent extensions to the degree that it makes like a CI system using it as an error unusable?
It is a risk that such a thing could happen. People could write code that did that. I think that in Kube, we'll do a fairly good job of having them be like, this is naughty, don't do that. Since it is an optional flag that someone have to opt into setting, having it fail on them so that they can then go look and say, oh, well, that guy was naughty, I guess I'm gonna have to turn it off here until I get them fixed, is a choice they can make, but I would expect fairly high.
I think we don't have a responsibility to protect users from themselves in this way. Like it's an opt-in flag. If you turn it on, like you're clearly accepting that a warning is going to cause an error for your command. I do think if we, and probably we should do this anyway, is like we should well document the sorts of things for which you can make a warning about, so that you make sure, or we at least have some sort of standard, and we can tell like, is this warning about, like we need to have some document we can point to when somebody adds a warning, where they can like go through a rubric and decide, is this a good warning or is this a frivolous warning?
Yeah, guidance makes sense. We would need to be explicit that warnings don't fall under API guarantees. I mean, like the fact that one of the warnings we're surfacing is around the deprecation should make that obvious. Like a thing that succeeded without warnings on one release might get warnings on a later release. And so if you are running in a mode that says treat warnings as errors, well, you're gonna get some errors.
Yeah, that's definitely like, and it also means you're gonna see, and like something that won't be a problem for like 4 more releases might suddenly be a problem for you today, which is like pushing up the time. Like if you want to keep that on, that's fine, but now you have to migrate like 4 releases before everybody else does.
Yeah.
I'm curious, David, when if you are supporting multiple releases, so say the thing you're dealing with is supporting everything that is supported by open source Kube. That strict mode will start failing on the newest release, but you can't actually switch to the replacement API that's recommending, because then you wouldn't work with your N-1 and N-2 releases. What would you do in that case?
What we do now is that we have flavors of things that work on, say, Cube 111, and we have different flavors of things that work on Cube 118, which is the difference between, say, OpenShift support for OpenShift 3.11 and OpenShift support for the latest 4.4, for whatever. So we already face this problem. It's far out of skew. It's a thing that you can choose to deal with. The flag is opt-in. You aren't forced to. But I can look at it and say, you know, would my life be better if many? Yes. Like I'm going through now and I'm saying like, oh my gosh, why are we on V1 beta 1 of this? We've had V1 for almost a year.
Don't tell anyone, but V1 beta 1 RBAC is way better than V1. It's a good vintage.
I also have a lot of people that can't even interact with the cluster in the right mode because CI has to do it. So if they don't check the log messages, which they don't do on running green tests or builds, they won't see the warning. So I guess it would help them to get a failing test because they have action items then. But the risk is, yeah, that there's a lot of them.
Earlier in the conversation, was the agreement that we don't want these to be structured, or that we did want them to be structured?
I am for unstructured warnings.
I was just kind of curious on like, and maybe this isn't kubectl's place, but it would be interesting to be like a warning about a deprecation that will affect you next release is a fatal warning for you right now because you act like it. Your time is up. It's time to go do something like you.
I told you, David. I told you.
I did not believe you were going to fill the time. I'll be honest. I didn't see that coming. I think at a certain point you end up like, yeah, you give a mouse a cookie, man. If we had this idea of warnings, I don't know that you'd get to pick and choose or try to interpret how the warnings hit you. And if you did try to do that, it really does feel like your own custom wrapper or alias on kubectl at that point, right? Like I'm watching kubectl to see if you have a deprecated API that I'm going to parse out against a server version to figure out whether that API is going to be removed in 3 months because you know how Jordan happened to write his English. That feels more aliasy than flaggy to me.
Here's maybe another way of handling this. Instead of making the warning structured and try to parse them and match them against some rule, maybe have a list of warnings that you know you tolerate for the moment, and you just revisit that like periodically.
I promised Jordan I would only have a Boolean flag.
No, so Mo, the structured aspect, that's really what the metrics were for. Like, if you want to make sure you get through your CI run and didn't use things that are deprecated that are going to be removed in the next release, like that information is present and structured and part of the metrics. Like it'll say these APIs and here's our target major minor removal dates. Like I think there are better ways to get that information.
Yeah, my point was more like you can parse standard error yourself, or like you can take standard error yourself and compare it to a table and fail your process if standard error contains something that isn't in the table, right? Like you don't need us to build something into kubectl to accomplish that.
Also, if you put up the effort to build something like that, you could also probably build an admission webhook that checks if the version you're sending is deprecated.
Yeah, you could.
You probably could, but my claim would be that like fail on warnings is not weird, and it's pretty easy to do, and it probably covers what these people intend, or at least what I would intend.
Yeah,
and if
I
the
would
choice
really
is,
like to avoid putting a lot of structure and like APIs within APIs. And if someone wants to do that sort of detailed, tell me if I'm using things that are going to go away in the next version. I think there are different recommendations we would make and have made in this proposal.
Yeah,
I agree. If the only justification for structured warnings is that we could do this logic, that doesn't seem compelling to me.
Yeah, I think I buy Jordan's argument that if you care about this, you probably care about it holistically, and the server side is probably a much better way for you to understand that. Right? Like having one particular client use something bad isn't the same as like knowing that like there's literally no one in your org.
Right, because the warning flag would only tell you about kube control use, right? Like it wouldn't tell you, by the way, that controller and that operator and that whatever, they're also using the deprecated APIs and like silently just doing that under the covers. Like you really want to check the metrics, probably.
Right, I agree.
This might not be part of the KEP, but is there a way to surface this in the API resources or cluster info or something to see, am I on a cluster that has, deprecation coming up soon, or just to be able to get a list of what all the deprecations would be for a cluster?
It is not in the KEP currently. That was asked earlier and I forgot to make a note of it. So consider adding deprecation status, I guess, to the API resource in Discovery.
Like we said, there's two places it could go: into our homegrown Discovery or into the OpenAPI document somewhere. Antoine pointed out in the chat that OpenAPI v3 has a field and schema level deprecation tag already.
I don't think I see that as something we would create a warning header for. So it seems
that wouldn't.
It's related to
that wouldn't be about that wouldn't be about getting a warning header. Like you wouldn't get a warning if you do API resources, get API resources or whatever. But you might want to see a column in the display, so like is deprecated or not.
Sure.
So in the interest of surfacing visibility as widely as possible, I will look into those two places in our API resource discovery and in potentially in the OpenAPI v2. It would have to be an extension. Once we get to OpenAPI v3, if we ever do, I think there is more first-class support for it in that schema. Okay. Are there other questions or anything else before we drop? 45 minutes, Bede. I told you to take the whole time.
This might not be applicable, but in a conversion webhook, if the API server, gets a warning, how, will it propagate it through to the user, or is that something that we would log to indicate that our storage version is, like, it's really a client issue only if they're requesting the deprecated version, but if we have the deprecated version stored, should we surface that as logs, or is there some mechanism as a CRD status that could be updated?
I think there's kind of two issues there. One is the thing I think David was asking for, which is like you should be able to give a warning in a webhook and that gets spun through the user. The other is like, what if the storage version is of the deprecated version? I think that is okay as long as it's not true when you remove the deprecated version.
Yeah, that's not user facing. The user using the non-deprecated version is what we care about. And so if the server has to do a conversion under the covers, that is not a thing that the user, that's particularly actionable for the user.
I guess more of the person who's managing the CRD, right? Like they'd need to change the storage version
That's
before
true.
they move to the deprecated.
Yeah.
So could it potentially, would it be useful, you know, to reflect it in the CRD status?
I mean,
Once we have the ability to mark a version deprecated in the CRD, I would consider like disallowing the storage version to be deprecated. Like if you want to mark a version deprecated, you need to have another version that is usable.
That's
yeah,
fair.
I don't know if I would do that, but it does seem like if you go to change your CRD and you're removing a version that is currently the storage version, we should disallow that change. Just like there's no good reason to do that. Basically make it impossible.
Yeah. There's logic to do that today. So if you have a version as a storage version and you just try to update the CRD to drop that, it does not allow you to.
Okay, good.
You have to explicitly update the status to remove that from the list of stored versions, which is the last step of doing your storage migration. And then it'll let you drop the version.
Yes. Okay. Storage migrator do that for you?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, okay. We don't have to answer that now.
Okay, I will write this up and send out another email. It'll probably be a day or two before I get this folded in, but send it out again. And if you want to take a look, I appreciate it.
Great, thanks, Jordan.
Thank you very much, Jordan. And thank you, everybody, for the participation, great discussion. I hope that you got everything you needed. And with that, very good. I think that was the one topic today. Remember, we do twice a week bug scrubs or bug triages, as we call it. So feel free to join us. They should be in your calendar if you are part of the mailing list. And I will upload this meeting later today to YouTube. And we'll see you again in 2 weeks. Thank you, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay positive.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
See ya.